Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. Today I want to talk about the R5 Canon and shooting it in crop mode, and also talk about the use of teleconverters and what you do and don't get by using, I guess, both of those ways of getting quote-unquote extra reach from your lenses. So if you're interested, stay tuned. All right, so talking about the crop mode on the Canon R5 and shooting teleconverters on the Canon R5 or any other camera for that matter that has a crop mode available to it. The reason why I wanted to do this video is because in recent videos I've done talking about the Canon R5 and the 100 to 500, for example, and the fact that it's a bit slow when you're at 500 millimeters at 7.1, it's naked with no teleconverter on it, then you put a 1.4 times teleconverter on it, and now you're at f10, right? Which is really a difficult scenario to shoot birds in flight, anything that has any kind of fast action, unless you have really good light, right? Well, I've had some people email me and they suggest, well, don't use a teleconverter, they use the crop mode in the camera to get your extra reach, right? On the 100 to 500, and then you don't suffer from a slower aperture problem. Well, that kind of discussions made me think that I should try to do a video on this subject, because I think there's some misconceptions about what the crop mode is, at least in the R5, how it works, compared to putting a teleconverter on a lens to get extra reach, right? So let's start out about talking about the crop mode and what it really does for you. And before we even do that, let's talk about my definition of extra reach, right? It's extra reach is not just when you look through the viewfinder, your subject, a bird in this case, looks bigger in the frame, right, than it did before. And no matter how you get to that point by going in the crop mode or putting a teleconverter on, but not only it looks bigger in the frame, but when it looks bigger in the frame, you're actually putting more of the pixels on the actual subject, on the bird, right? That's extra reach. The R5 has 45 megapixels. When I put a teleconverter on whatever lens and the bird gets bigger in the frame, I'm taking advantage of all those 45 megapixels and putting more megapixels on my bird by making it bigger in the frame with the use of a teleconverter. When you go into crop mode, that is not what you're doing. That's not what you're getting. The bird's going to look bigger in the frame again, right? But it's not using all 45 megapixels now to get that bird bigger in the frame. It's cropping into the center of the sensor, going from 45 megapixels in the case of the R5 down to just 17. So you're really not getting quote-unquote extra reach by my definition. Sure, the bird looks bigger when you go into crop mode, but the number of pixels on the bird stays exactly the same as if you left it in full frame mode. Things just look bigger. And for sure, there's advantages to having the bird look bigger in the frame, even if you're not putting more pixels on the actual bird, but that is not getting extra reach. So what are some of the advantages then of shooting in crop mode if it's not to get more pixels on your actual subject? Well, like I said, the bird looks bigger. In this case, let's just talk about bird photography, and the bird, small bird, it looks bigger, makes it easier to get autofocus acquisition on the part of the bird that you want, like the eye, for example. You know, when you use the autofocus system, again on the R5 as the example here, and you go into crop mode, the amount of the frame that is actually covered by, let's say, the zone, different zone settings of the zone autofocus in the R5 cover more of the viewfinder, more of the frame. So it's easier then, of course, to get the autofocus to grab the subject, because it just has to be somewhere in the frame there to probably touch a part of the active autofocus sensor that's active. If the bird's much smaller in the frame and the frame of the autofocus doesn't cover as much area, it gets a little more difficult to get not only the bird grabbed by the autofocus, but to get autofocus on the right part of the bird. So there are some advantages to going into crop mode. Another crop mode advantage is if you're shooting and you need to get something to a publisher right away, you don't have time to go into post-processing. You want to get that framing real close, right up front, bird big in the frame, in camera, go into crop mode, you can get that. Don't have to go into post-processing, just send it off the way it was framed in camera. And so that can be a great use of going into the crop mode. But in the sense of shooting birds in flight, anything really active, really fast, crop mode can make things more difficult for at least some people. When the bird's really big in the frame and your field of view is much smaller, it can be harder to find your subject in the viewfinder. It can be harder to keep it in the frame, and thus harder to track and get good images in general when things are so much bigger in the frame. Some people may like the bird bigger in the frame, because then when you do get it in the frame and you're tracking it, you have to basically be tracking at the same speed as the bird's going, or your fast subject is going, in order for it to be there for you to acquire in the viewfinder and keep it in the viewfinder. So you're going to get really accurate panning that way. So that can be an advantage, right? So there are advantages to shooting in crop mode. Another disadvantage of shooting in crop mode is that if the bird is really big in the frame, or your subject in general is really big in the frame, then when you get to post-processing, that composition you made in the field with the crop in body is basically what you've got, right? You can crop in more if you want, but you can't decide now that you want to, say, pull back a little bit, like, oh, that isn't quite the composition I wanted, I wish I could pull back. Well, you're kind of stuck. If you don't put it in crop mode and you shoot the bird smaller in the frame, and then you go into post and you crop in post instead of in the camera, you will have more latitude, right, to make the framing, to make the composition what you want. And in the end, you're getting the exact same thing. You're not gaining anything or losing anything by going with cropping in post. You can make basically the exact same image in post that you did by cropping, quote unquote, in camera. So there's not a whole lot of advantage, for me anyway, to shoot in crop mode. Now, if I really want more reach, that is more pixels on my subject, the bird bigger in the frame, I put on teleconverters, right? 1.4 times teleconverter, 2 times teleconverter, if I can. A lot of times I think on the 100 to 500 I'm not going to, because it's going to make the lens too slow. But I have a 600 f4 and I can put a 1.4 times teleconverter on that 600 f4 and be at f5.6. Most of the time that's still plenty fast, okay? A lot of times I want to get to f7.1 or f8 anyway, to get the depth of field, just to get a little gain of depth of field. So for me, that's plenty good. And by using a 1.4 most of the time and not so much a 2 times, you minimize one of the disadvantages of putting on a teleconverter, and that's degradation of your image quality, right? You don't get any, there's not a lot that you can get in photography free without any kind of drawback. And putting teleconverters on do have drawback. We talked about the one where you lose your speed of your lens a little bit, depending, but you can also lose some image quality. And so my experience has been with the 1.4 times teleconverters anyway, that you really don't lose a whole lot of image quality if you're starting out with a lens that was really, really sharp to begin with. Going to 2 times teleconverters, that can be a little bit trickier. The more magnification you tend to do to a lens, the more image quality you tend to lose. So 2 times, I've done it 1200 millimeters on my 600 f4, and it can be really, really nice, right? Atmospherics can get in the way when you start getting at 1200 millimeters, even 840 millimeters on a 600 f4 with the 1.4 times teleconverter. But anyway, you're getting actual extra reach now, right? Because all of those 45 megapixels are being used, and the bigger the bird in the frame is when you use a teleconverter, the more pixels you're getting on the bird, and so you've got more latitude to keep, you know, nice detail in crops that you make in post, or hopefully maybe you can frame the bird just like you want, and now you've got a full frame 45 megapixel image of the bird that you're after, and man, you know, the details are going to be just outstanding in that situation if you did everything else right, right? So there's really the extra reach situation is best dealt with either by going with a longer lens in general, right? 800 millimeter lens if you have one or whatever, naked, or by using teleconverters, which is what most people do when you're doing bird photography. You're either out there with a maximum probably of 600 millimeters you know, naked on a lens, and then if you want 840 or 1200, you're going to teleconverters, right? So, you know, it's really the way to get extra reach that is really extra reach, and not just an in-body crop like you're doing with the crop mode on the R5. Now, the only other thing I really want to say about teleconverters is that not all teleconverters are created equal. I've heard a lot of people say, you know, I tried teleconverters on my 600 f4 or whatever, and man, the image quality just is so bad, you know, compared to the lens without the teleconverter. And, you know, that really shouldn't be the case, especially with a 1.4 times, and even with the 2 times, it should be pretty darn good when you're using quality equipment. And the reason is that you may have a bad teleconverter, right? Maybe not in the sense that it's made wrong or there was an error, but it may not match up well with your particular copy of your lens and your body. Teleconverters are not made for any specific lens, obviously, or any specific lens body combination. So sometimes you have to search. Example, I went through 4 different 2 times teleconverters, EF teleconverters, to pair with my 600 f4 before I found one that I was happy with. Not just image quality wise, but autofocus performance wise and everything else. So, you know, don't take it for granted that just because you spent $500 on a premium teleconverter that it should just be perfect and work the way it should. It may not. So if you're having problems, try a different version of the teleconverter you're using, and you may find that you find a better one, right? Maybe you won't, but I bet you probably will, and you might open up an avenue to getting more reach, an avenue that you thought was kind of closed off to you because you just didn't think you could get decent image quality. And I'll show some pictures. I've got some pictures I'll link to, shot with the 1.4 times teleconverter on the 1.5 and on the 600 f4. And you can see, I mean, good grief. I mean, the image quality is really, really good. And so, you know, it's really something that I depend on a lot, is teleconverters. Now, what about the image quality of the crop mode in the R5? Well, it's great. It really is. It's wonderful. If 17 megapixels will work for you, and maybe even having to crop in a little bit more in post to get the composition you want on your bird, going even lower than 17 megapixels, then, you know, if that will do what you need it to do, as far as printing or entering competitions or just having the resolution and the detail on your subject that you want, then by all means shoot the crop mode. But if you really need more resolution on your subject, the only way to do it is to go with a longer lens in general, or stick a teleconverter on the lenses that you have and go with the extra reach that way. So anyway, I think, you know, we can end the conversation right there in, you know, the discussion about crop mode versus in whether you're really getting extra reach or not out of that, versus using longer lenses or teleconverters. All right, so we're now in camera here, obviously, and I've got a really cooperative bunting in the bush over here. I think he'll probably stay there all day for us. Let's try some autofocus here on the head. Watch, I love this. Eye autofocus, right? Look at that, right on the eye. That's just, Canon R5, right, is just amazing as far as autofocus goes. But that's not what we're talking about here today. We're talking about crop mode in the R5 versus putting teleconverters on, right? And so what I wanted to show here is what happens in crop mode in the R5, and kind of supplement what I already said in the major body of this video. But right now we're in full frame mode, right? So I've got the cropping menu programmed to my auto focus point button right next to the asterisk button on the back of my camera. So you can see right there that we're in full frame mode, right? So when we're in full frame mode, that's what you got at 500 millimeters, right? We're at 500 millimeters, and you can see the size of the autofocus frame there. I'm in zone right now. I can change it to wide zone if you want. We can go to center point with surround points if you want, right? Just a center point. You get the smaller point there. And so anyway, you know, you can kind of get an idea of what we've got to work with here at 500 millimeters. Now, if we go into full frame or crop mode 1.6, boom, right? There you go. So that's what you're gaining through the viewfinder, and it looks like, boy, we gained all this extra reach, right? Well, no, it's, again, like I said in the body of the video, we don't gain a whole lot of reach here. We gain what looks like reach, but we lose a lot of resolution. We just went from 45 megapixels, right, here to 17 megapixels here. That's a big, big hit as far as I'm concerned, especially because you can do the same thing in post-processing. If you took the image like this, I can get this composition, the exact same image in post, right? So it's really not giving you much in the way of extra reach. Now, what is it giving you? Well, you can see the bird a lot better, right? So maybe the autofocus can do better, getting on the eye like that with the eye detect and tracking, or even with just regular zone, you can get on the head better because it's got the bird's bigger in the frame. You can see that the zone, right? The zone brackets cover much larger portion of the frame now, so that can be nice, especially if you go, let's say, to wide bracketing. It basically covers the whole frame now, right? So that can be a great advantage, especially if you got a fast-moving subject and you want it to fill the frame and have the autofocus have no other choice really but to grab the bird. It can be tougher, a little bit tougher. Let's bring down the exposure a little bit there. It can be tougher to keep the bird in the frame, right, and track it if it's moving really, really quickly when you're this close. But you've got a lot more autofocus coverage there, that's for sure. So that can be nice, right? So there are some advantages here to shooting in the crop mode, like I mentioned earlier in the video. But you take that hit, because when you go, you can look right here. It has the little magnifying glass up there with the 1.6, right? When you're in there, that means it's a crop mode, right? And it says right up at the top there, it says 17 megapixels. 5088 by 3392, whereas if you go to full, right, 45M, 8192 by 5464, right? So it is a pretty big hit. So you just have to look at your shooting scenario and what you're really after, and whether this is really going to help you out or not. Again, I like it going here, and you can basically get the same image, same composition if you want, in post-processing, and it actually gives you more latitude to make an alternate composition, right, that you wouldn't have if you were all the way in here. And that's what you had to work with. Of course, you could get closer if you wanted to. You could crop in more, but then you're even less resolution, right? Down even from 17 megapixels down even smaller. So personally, I don't use crop mode very much. I basically stick to putting on teleconverters. If I want the image if I want the bird to be bigger in the image itself, and I want it to look like this, then I'm going to go ahead and put a teleconverter on there and have all of my 45 megapixels in that frame right there, and a whole lot more of those megapixels on my actual subject than if I was in the crop mode, right? Because when you're here again, you're losing a lot. So anyway, that's all I wanted to do in camera here, is to kind of show what things look like, and as you switch back and forth, and talk a little bit more about the advantages and disadvantages. So if you like this video, please subscribe. I've got several other videos out there now. And until next time, get out there, be safe, take some images, and I'll see you soon.